Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Art of Awesomeness podcast. This is episode 76. I'm your host, Adrian Kiswani. I have a pretty good topic for you guys today. It's a simple one. This is going to be a shorter episode. As you can see, I'm by myself, and this is probably a shorter episode because I'm not used to recording by myself. So forgive me if I'm awkward or if I'm not maybe giving you the podcast experience that you so yearn for. But just know, for any of you regular listeners who are constantly tuning into the podcast, there may be some changes coming up to the podcast, maybe major changes coming up to the podcast. So just keep an eye out for those. I'm definitely going to be vocal about what's going on regarding this podcast and about our presence on YouTube in general. And so for anyone who is a regular listener to this podcast and, the weekly uploads, you tune into them, thank you, first and foremost. And so I'm just letting you guys know in advance that there may be some changes to the podcast. I'm still in my head figuring out just exactly how to approach said changes and how to administer them to the podcast to make sure that this is the best product that we can bring to you listeners and viewers. And so just know that there may be some changes coming up in the near future, and just to kind of be aware of that if you are a regular listener. And so everything that we do is to try and improve this podcast and to try and make it the best that we can. And so sometimes that involves changing it and adapting it to what we believe to be the best for it. So just keep that in mind. Just wanted to kind of open with that and get that out of the way. And then, of course, we do have the first order of business, which is Happy National Proposal Day. So if you're thinking about proposing to someone and you haven't yet, Proposal Day is a good day to do it because you can say that you did it on Proposal Day. Kind of a flex, Happy National Ravioli Day. I like raviolis. They're not bad. Happy National World Flower Day. It might just mean exactly what it means. Yeah, okay. It's the importance of flour. So, if you eat flour, which you probably do, you can celebrate it. You can make some flour tortillas or something like that if you're in the mood. And then finally, we have spring. So happy National Spring Day, which just means that it's spring now. Winter is officially over as of the release of this episode. So happy spring, everyone. Make it a good one. And that's awesome. Actually, I just realized that as I'm recording this episode, which is kind of crazy too. Did not know that it was spring already. That's awesome. But yeah, those are the national days. Again, I'll probably talk about it at a later date, but there may be some changes to the podcast and the way that it's put out in the near future. Again, I myself don't even know necessarily what that means yet. So I can't really tell you exactly what it means because I'm still trying to figure out just exactly how to go about these things. But with that being said, for those of you who do still regularly tune in, genuinely appreciate you guys tuning in. And just thank you for taking time out of your day to click on our videos and watch the content that we make. We always try to make it the best that we can. Now, this episode regarding the podcast, we've done something similar in the past before. We did this in, I forget exactly which episode it was, but it was an episode in which we talked about how to start a podcast. It might just be called that. I think that might be the actual title of the episode, but it was something along the lines of how to begin or start a podcast. It was around the time that Mr. Campos, who was a guest on this podcast, he was thinking of starting one, kind of regarding not therapy, but more like advice and things of that nature, counsel. And so we were inspired by that, we kind of said, oh, okay, well, here are some of our thoughts on how you can start a podcast if you want to. But I realized in that moment that we didn't actually go over why you should start a podcast. And I was, in coming up for ideas with this video, I was actually, funny enough, asking my mom any ideas. In typical mom fashion, she started Googling podcast topic ideas, as if I haven't done that millions of times before in the past. But she came across, people like top 10 lists and things of that nature. And so in honor of Christian, who often, instead of rating things out of 10 or doing things in 10, he likes to cut it in half and do it in 5. In honor of that, I'm going to do a top 5 list in this episode, specifically regarding the top 5 reasons as to why you should start a podcast. Not how to start a podcast. We've already gone over that before in the past. But this episode is going to be completely centered as to why you should start a podcast. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, if it's something that maybe interests you and you are considering, I listen to a lot of podcasts, maybe I want to start one myself, here are some reasons that you can use to justify or kind of motivate yourself to realize, maybe I do really want to actually pursue this and try podcasting out for myself. I have a whole list right here of 5 things. They're relatively simple. Again, this episode's probably going to be pretty short. I'm probably not going to have too much to say about all of these, but I think that they are pretty good, solid 5 points that, when I was thinking to myself, about starting a podcast, these are some of the 5 things that I was like, they made me feel as though I could actually do it, that it was within my grasp, let's say. And so the first, I guess, reason why you should start a podcast if you are considering it is the fact that it's really quite easy to do. It's not something that is, maybe, let's say, as labor intensive as starting a YouTube channel, where you might have to go out and buy a camera and, get some lighting equipment or something like that, set up a studio or a space. Now, nowadays, a lot of podcasts actually end up, I guess ours is a good example. We put our podcasts up on YouTube, right? We record our podcasts so that people can actually view them. But the fact of the matter is that that's not really the most important part of a podcast, right? The most important part of the podcast is the audio. At its core, that's what a podcast is. So as long as you can get the audio of you talking or someone else talking, that's really all you need to start a podcast. And the fact of the matter is, most people have exactly just the only thing that you need to start a podcast, and that's a phone, right? If you have a phone, then you can record I wouldn't say like Joe Rogan quality audio, but you can record solid audio of people in a room, right, sitting at a table. You can hold it to yourself and speak into it. Because at the end of the day, in order to really just start a podcast, if that's what we're talking about, right, starting a podcast, all you need is some way to record audio and some way to upload said audio. So, the website that we use to upload our audio to Spotify and things of that nature, Anchor is what it's called. Really, all you need is an Anchor account, and which is free, by the way. All you need is an Anchor account and a cell phone to record your audio. And even if you just wanted to take it a little bit of a step above that, this microphone that I'm speaking into right now is only about $48, right? So not a huge expense. It's not a Joe Rogan microphone or anything like that. But if you're thinking about just starting a podcast and you don't really want to overcommit and just pay for a bunch of stuff and make a studio setup and, record things to put on YouTube, and you just want to start out just to kind of dip your toes in the water and see whether or not this is for you or not, podcasting really isn't that high a risk pursuit, because it takes relatively little to make a podcast. Of course, there are things like coming up with ideas and being able to, maybe hold conversation if you want to do interviews. And, there's plenty of other things like staying consistent that can, influence the, I guess, difficulty or challenge range of starting a podcast. But technically, from a technical standpoint, if you're just using your phone and an Anchor account where you upload the phone audio to the Anchor account and then title it and submit it, that's really all you need to do to start a podcast. And so if that's your goal, right, if you're thinking, well, is it hard to start a podcast? Not nearly as hard as it is to start, say, a YouTube channel or a Twitch streaming channel or something like that, right, where it includes, maybe some lighting and a nice camera and things of that nature. Now, look, for podcasting, you can always upgrade, right? A lot of podcasters nowadays, They have nice studio setups where they record it and they put it on YouTube. But the fact of the matter is that you really only need the audio. And as long as you have some means to record passable audio and you have some way to upload it to, say, Spotify or something of that nature, then you're pretty much golden. You're pretty much set to start the podcast. So the first reason would just be the ease. It's really not that difficult to start a podcast. And even for someone who's in a budget, most people who are at the age of where they might be thinking about starting a podcast probably have a phone and they probably have a computer to record audio and upload it. So for most people, starting the podcast technically and financially is actually not as hard as a lot of people make it out to be. There are plenty of tutorials online of people saying you got to buy these really nice microphones and how to set up a podcast if you have a lot of money to put into it. But if you're like us and you don't have a lot of money to put into these things and you're just trying to see how things go and you're just trying to start out to see whether or not this is even something that you enjoy or not, podcasting really isn't that bad a thing to get into if you're worried about overcommitting or you're worried about it just draining you financially or anything like that. It's actually a pretty easy and fun thing to get into. And that leads to my second reason as to why you should start podcasting, and that's because it's fun, or at the very least it should be fun, right? See, if you start a podcast, you can start a podcast about pretty much anything. And if you start a podcast, it's probably going to be surrounding a passion of yours or surrounding something that you have an interest in or that you're talented at, right? So when you start a podcast, you really can make it your own. And when you're able to do that, when you have the freedom to make a podcast your own, it can really allow you to express a side of yourself to people that you might not otherwise have the opportunity to do, right? Because podcast formats allow you to just talk for long extended periods of time and often with other people, right? I've seen a lot of podcasts, to be honest, where I'll watch them and it's literally just a room full of guys who maybe got off work or, it's at the end of the week, they all get together and they just talk, they just joke around and they record it, right? So it's pretty much what they would do anyways, right? Just hang out as guys and enjoy one another's company, crack jokes and things of that nature, but they record it and people enjoy it, right? They gain something from what you're putting out there. And so what that means is that you can have fun doing something that you're already passionate about, and then you can turn it into something else that other people can enjoy, right? So if you're really passionate about sports, for example, right? There are plenty of people who want to hear people talk about sports in an enthusiastic and an educated manner, right? If you're someone who's really into sports, it would pique your interest if there was a podcast out there where other people who also like sports, talk about it in depth and at length, right? Because that's something that they're passionate about. And when you're passionate about something, people who are passionate about that thing, they gravitate towards that, right? So if you're passionate about sports or you're passionate about movies or something like that, other people who are passionate about those things will gravitate towards your podcast and you'll build an audience that enjoys what you enjoy, thus making it fun for you. Because one thing that can, worry people is, okay, if you're starting a podcast, this might drain your energy. You might not know what to talk about. I mean, these things can stress people out, especially if you're trying to make a regular podcast or something like that. But if you're doing your podcast based around something that you genuinely enjoy and you genuinely get joy out of and are willing to spread that joy to other people, then the whole production process of the podcast will bring you joy, knowing that not only did you enjoy making it, but the people who are going to listen to it are going to actually gain something from you. And so you kind of create this nice dynamic between the creator and the audience where you enjoy what you do and the people who enjoy what you enjoy come together and support you because you're putting out content that they can rally around, that they can really gain something from, that they might not get somewhere else. For example, I know a lot of people who listen to, Joe Rogan. They listen to Joe Rogan oftentimes for the real news behind certain celebrities or certain people instead of actual news outlets, just because in Joe Rogan's podcast, he just allows people to talk. There's no editing, there's no headlines and clickbaity, thumbnails. It just kind of is what it is. And people gravitate towards that, I guess, kind of rawness of the content, right? Whereas maybe, mainstream media news might not offer that. So there's always something that you're passionate about that other people will also have an interest in. And so long as you're maintaining passion about what you're doing and you genuinely enjoy what you do, other people will see that and they'll gravitate towards it. So the whole process of making a podcast and sustaining a podcast should be fun. And am I saying that it's going to be completely easy and there aren't going to be bumps in the road? Absolutely not. But overall, the experience should be a fun one that you enjoy and that you're able to gain something from. And not only you, but the people who watch you will be able to gain things from what you say or what people on your podcast say, et cetera, et cetera. So number one, right, it's easy to start a podcast. Number two, if you're passionate about what you're talking about, if you really have an interest as to why you're doing this, then it's going to be fun. And it's not just going to be fun at the beginning, but it's going to get more fun throughout because you're going to accumulate an audience of people who are like-minded and who also enjoy the same things as you. So that is very important. And that's going to make sure that you can continue going. Even through, I guess you could say, rough patches that all creators basically go through, whether it be YouTube or whether it be podcasting or streaming or, whatever, right? So number three, this kind of comes off of what I just said right now, but not only just your audience, but other creators who are in kind of the same arena or the same field as you, this can actually bring people together, podcasting, right? I mean, for example, one of the earlier guests that we had on the podcast, right? David and Neil were people who they have a podcast. It's late. They have a podcast called Among Wolves, where they basically go into and delve into Catholic doctrine, pop culture, kind of how it relates, their perspective on things. So like Christian and I, they're two guys who are passionate about their faith and they go into certain subsets of that, right? And kind of talk about their experience. Obviously, we're not Catholic. Our channel or podcast, it's not a Catholic podcast, but there is still that element of, these are people who are like-minded. They're doing a very similar thing to what we're doing. And by us doing the same thing, we were able to come together and kind of examine what we did and learn from each other in many ways. I remember when we were talking to David and Neil, they were actually giving us advice on certain things we could do to enhance our podcast in their opinion. And it was just interesting to hear from people who had been podcasting longer. That's one of the things when you start podcasting, it's not one of these things where it's an isolation tank. There are thousands of podcasters out there, many of whom are actually talking about the same things that you will be talking about. So if you're able to connect with these people, whether it be following them on their Instagram or reaching out to them via their business email or something like that, there's actually a huge opportunity for growth and networking within the podcasting community because there are just so many people out there who are doing very similar things to one another. And so this is when you can get cool things like crossovers where two podcast hosts will come together and maybe interview each other, or they'll get a group of podcasters who talk about the same thing to all come together to, I guess, kind of have a mega podcast conference about whatever their specialty is, right? You'll have a bunch of people who do sports, a bunch of people who delve into philosophy, all of these different things. They all have subsets of communities within them, right? The podcast community is not just one size fits all community, right? It's a bunch of people who specialize in different avenues of thinking and different avenues of entertainment. I mean, it's just a bunch of different people who are all passionate about different things. And these people kind of cluster together, right? I've been saying sports a lot just because that's on my mind, but like sports podcast, right? Philosophy podcasts where people review books, podcasts where people interview each other, military podcasts, history podcasts, right? All of these groups have subsets within them of people who are constantly networking and talking to one another, helping each other to improve, right? So if you're just starting your podcast, A fear can be, you're a small fish in a really big pond, right? And that pond has monster fish like Joe Rogan and Jocko Willing and Jordan Peterson and people of that nature who are killing it as far as podcasts go. And then it just gets progressively smaller and smaller and smaller until, in your mind, there's you at the very bottom, just starting your podcast, right? But the truth is, there are plenty of people all the way that go up to the top who are talking about the same thing you're talking about. So if you're able to network with people whose interests align with yours, you can actually move up the hierarchy chain basically just by proximity, just by knowing and interacting and collabing with people who have similar interests to you. And you can also make genuine friends this way. It doesn't just have to be about some kind of a business, I'm just going to get to the top by utilizing these people. It's more so to actually make genuine friends and connections of people who actually are enjoying the same thing that you're enjoying. So it can be an opportunity not only to grow your podcast, but to actually make genuine connections as well to people who are interested in the same thing as you. And again, it can be a scary thing for podcasters who are thinking that they're going into this alone. But I guarantee you, if you have a podcast topic, there is someone out there who is doing a very similar, if not the same exact topic that you're doing. So don't feel alone when you're starting a podcast thinking, I don't know if there's anyone out there who's going to listen to this. I don't think anyone's going to care about this. If you have a topic that you care about, I guarantee you there's someone else out there in the world who cares about that same thing too. Now, your audience might not be as big or small as some other topic, right? That might be more culturally poignant or something that more people are just interested in. But there's still going to be people where you're going to be able to scratch their itch, so to speak, based on whatever you talk about. They're going to gain something from it. And that's how you can grow an audience. That's how you can start networking with people, is just to find people who podcast the same topic that you're podcasting. And so making connections that way and making friends in that manner can really help you to start your podcast on a good note, right? Start your podcast by having guests, right? Start your podcast by including other people who are going to help give you advice and help move you in the right direction, right? Because if you're just starting out, you really don't know much. And so it would be wise to actually gain counsel from people who've actually been doing this for some time and have found success podcasting, right? It just makes sense to look to someone who's doing better than you and say, okay, what are they doing that I could be doing, that I could be implementing to improve my podcast? And if you're able to reach out to them and they're nice enough to talk to you, then boom, you've made a connection and you're already working your way towards making your podcast even better than it already has been. So that's an important one to consider, because making those connections can go a long way, especially in the business world, especially if you try to monetize your podcast later. Making those connections can be a big deal. So don't be afraid to reach out to podcasters who are doing your same topic. Don't be like, oh man, they wouldn't want to listen to me. They wouldn't want to, deal with my podcast. I have a really small platform. There are plenty of podcasters out there who are genuinely interested in helping out other podcasters. So look out for those people, reach out to them and make connections. I know I spent a long time on that, but I think that that's pretty important. Number 4, this is one that is pretty close to home for me, is that a podcast, if you're willing to do a weekly podcast or something along those lines, it can really teach you consistency, right? Consistency is a very valuable trait that, a lot of people in our modern world, just because of the quick access to everything and short attention spans and things of that nature, because of social media and just constantly being plugged into lightning fast internet speeds, sometimes it can be hard to actually focus on a task for more than 10 seconds. And of course, podcasts can sometimes go on for hours, right? So when you start podcasting, if you're podcasting for even just an hour, that's going to teach you to be able to focus on a certain topic or a certain issue for that amount of time, right? And the more that you actually take time to actually delve into a topic and the more time you take to think on things, it's actually going to make you smarter and it's going to make you more consistent, right? If you're uploading a podcast every week, which, we've done on this podcast. There's been a podcast every week up to this point. We've always been able to stay consistent in that manner. And consistency is not only good for maybe viewership or keeping an audience engaged, but consistency is actually a very valuable lesson to the podcaster themselves, because consistency is not just something that helps you in the podcasting world, right? Consistency helps you throughout any area of life. So if you're someone who maybe struggles with consistency and you're really just dedicated to making this podcast, the podcast can actually teach you how to be more consistent, right? How to manage your time better so that your podcasts come out on time, right? Because nothing's more stressful than when it's almost time for your podcast to debut and you're not done with it yet. It hasn't been finished. It hasn't even been recorded, let alone edited or anything of that nature. So being able to find a certain level of consistency and being able to find a certain flow where you are being able to constantly upload content at a regular pace, at a regular basis that's comfortable for you, but also still challenging, that's a nice medium to be. And that's a very valuable thing for people to learn who perhaps haven't learned consistency yet, or at least they're trying to become more consistent in other areas, right? The podcast can actually help you in that. And for this podcast, we at the beginning didn't know how long it was going to last. We really didn't really have a time frame. We just started it, but I knew that I wanted to make it a consistent weekly podcast. And so for over a year now, we have gone every single week, every single Sunday, an Art of Awesomeness podcast has dropped without fail, and that's something that I'm happy about. It's something that is a nice challenge for yourself, every week. Podcast, I'm going to make a new one, and it challenges you to come up with a new topic. It challenges you to, think about something new to talk about. And it challenges you to continually put in work into something that you care about, right? If you're passionate about making a podcast, if you're interested in making a podcast, staying consistent is going to teach you a lot more than just getting things done at a certain time every week, right? It's going to teach you whether or not this really means something to you, right? It's going to teach you the value of consistent hard work, right? And what that pays off to be. Because if you post a podcast every month or 3 months, as opposed to saying, yeah, I uploaded a podcast every week for a year, there's a clear winner in terms of the sense of accomplishment and fulfillment when you're able to maintain consistency for a certain period of time. And so even if your challenge is, hey, you know what, I want to make a podcast episode every week for 6 months, right? That's my goal. And you reach that goal and you're like, okay, maybe I can do it for another 6 months. Then you've hit a year, right? And you just keep making those goals for yourself and trying to keep upping whatever content that you're making. But a big part of that is maintaining consistency. And so not only with the podcast, but consistency is just going to translate very well into other aspects of life. And so for me, I would say especially the podcast has taught me a lot about the importance of dedication and consistency to something that you care about, right? So don't overlook the value of being consistent. Don't overlook the value of keeping at whatever you're passionate about, because especially if you're just starting a podcast, the last thing you want is for you to get really fired up, debut episode 1, and then episode 2 comes out 3 weeks later, because then most of the people who were excited for episode 1, they're waiting and waiting and waiting for episode 2. And by the time episode 2 comes out, most of those people have forgotten that you even started a podcast, right? Because you haven't been consistent enough. So consistency is good for the audience and it's good for you too. So make sure that when you're starting a podcast that you maintain a high level of consistency if possible. But believe me, for most cases, it's possible. It's just about pacing yourself and understanding what you are and are not capable of with what you have at the time, right? Just make sure that you do a careful evaluation of what you're capable of. And if you're capable of it, do it. And if you're not, don't. But if you can, it's important to stay consistent. And that would be number 4 as to one of the reasons why you should start a podcast, because it will teach you the value of consistency and it will teach you how to constantly put in work into something that you're passionate about and get value from that. And the final one that I have regarding why you should start a podcast is really because you can just make it your own. It doesn't matter what other people are making out there in the world. If you want to make a podcast about anything in the world, you can, right? There's nothing stopping you from making a podcast about anything in the world that you want to make it. So this can be a very freeing thing if you are someone who maybe, you work at a job that maybe isn't your dream job or anything like that, but you're still passionate about something and you want to project that into the world, right? You want to share your knowledge, you want to share a new perspective with people. And this can be anything, right? Well, podcasting is a great way to accomplish this goal, right? Even if you're not maybe fulfilled or feeling as though you're being able to project your perspective or your ideas into the world with what you're doing right now, a podcast is just one of the easiest ways in the world to get your opinions, get your perspectives, get your ideas out there. Because all you have to do is speak them. You just have to talk them into existence through a microphone, through your phone, upload that, and it's out into the world. And like I said earlier, people who are interested in what you have to hear and say are going to gravitate towards those things because there's always someone who's interested in something that you have to say. Most likely, almost definitely. I'm not going to say 100% because sometimes people say crazy stuff that no one wants to hear, but most of the time, what you have to hear, people want to hear as well. And that's going to be for almost everything. So when it comes to making a podcast, one of the biggest appeals, especially to me when I was starting, was the fact that I could really make it anything in the world that I wanted, and there wasn't anyone who could tell me, no, you shouldn't do that, or you should make it, this way. There really wasn't any of that pressure to make something that I wasn't 100% happy about, right? If you're making a podcast, there's really no one out there who can tell you not to do something, right? Like when we were starting a podcast, I didn't see many podcasts with an intermission, right? But we just started doing intermissions in our podcast. Why? Because I thought that would be a funny idea to just throw memes in there or cool videos, just smack dab in the middle of the podcast. Or for example, was it the verse of the day and the national days? Like the national days we got from our history teacher, Mr. Feinstein, who every single day at the beginning of class, he would announce the national days. And that just inspired us to add that into the podcast. So there are certain things that you can make uniquely your own, that even if you are talking about a common topic, that there are a bunch of other podcasters who are talking about the same thing, you can still stand out by adding your own unique elements to your podcast that can make you different from everybody else. Even if the topics and the content is very similar, you're still adding a unique perspective that is uniquely your own, right? And the elements that you add to your podcast can elevate that, right? Are you gonna add things at the beginning or the end, in the middle? We decided to kind of go with all three, right? National days, intermission, verse of the day. And, people seem to like that. We would ask for feedback on what people thought about the verse of the day, national days, intermission. And people said, yeah, those are cool things. Those are unique ideas that we didn't really see in many other podcasts, and it's cool that you guys implement it. And so really, at the end of the day, one of the highest praises I can give to podcasting is the fact that it really gives you a platform to do whatever you want, right? And there's pretty much an infinite amount or potential for growth within that. So there isn't really a limit that you can hit where you've reached the absolute capacity for what your podcast can hold. There's always another place you can go. There's always something else that you can improve on, and there's always something else that hasn't been explored yet as far as podcasting, right? Podcasting didn't exist, a few decades ago, right? Now it's one of the biggest things in the world as far as entertainment and education is concerned. So there's always room for growth. There's always room for experimentation, and you can always add your unique flair to all of those things. So don't be afraid to step outside the box when it comes to podcasting. If you have a really good idea and you think that it can work, put it in your podcast and see how it goes. And if you think, nah, you know what, it was a good idea in my head, but it didn't really relay the way I wanted it to, then that's fine. You just go back to the drawing board, try another idea and see if that one sticks. And you just keep doing that until you find a nice flow of content that you think is, that you're happy about, that you're passionate about, and that you think is benefiting other people. And so those are the 5 things that I would recommend are the best reasons to start a podcast. If you're wondering, should I start a podcast? I would put these as some of the top reasons as to why you should. And if you're even considering a podcast, there's a good chance that, deep down it's something that you really want to do, but you just don't really maybe have the best concocted vision for it. So if you want to watch our other podcast that we did on how to start a podcast, feel free to watch that one, because that one we kind of go into our experience actually starting the podcast and how we got things rolling. This one is just more so as to why you should, right? The reasons why I think it's beneficial to start a podcast if you're thinking about it. And then that episode goes into how exactly to start the podcast. But I hope that you guys found this episode insightful and helpful. I know you guys aren't really used to me just talking by myself, so I'm sorry if this was a bit of a weirder episode. Christian couldn't make it for this podcast, just so you know. I actually just finished seeing him right now. But yeah, this is, I guess at the end of the day, podcasting really is what you make it. And so, these 5 reasons, these are just my 5 reasons as to why I would start a podcast. Your reasons may be different. And if you have any other reasons why you're just like, this is why people should start a podcast, or maybe you have a podcast and you're saying, yeah, this is why I started, let me know in the comments and leave them below as to why you think people should start podcasts, or if you started a podcast, why you actually ended up starting a podcast yourself, because I'd be interested to know your reasons, if they differ from mine, or even if they are the same as mine, just let me know. With that, we have the verse of the day, and the verse of the day is going to be Deuteronomy 32:2, and that says, "My doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as a small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass." And what's that basically teaching is that God's doctrine, God's teachings, they drop upon the grass, right? They water the grass, and the grass is kind of a symbolic representation of the people who hear God's teaching, right? Who hear God's word. God's word is there to water and help grow the believer. It's there to help water and grow the people who are already taking in God's word. God's word is there to enhance your life, to grow you, and to make you into an overall better person, right? It's just like when it rains on the grass and the grass grows. That's the same way God's word is with people. When people hear God's word, they're going to grow, and they are going to increase their knowledge and their understanding of the Lord. And so I think that's a nice verse that kind of pertains to spring, with it raining and all that, and all the different flowers and stuff growing. And if you have allergies, I'm so sorry. But yeah, that was our episode for this week. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. I'm sorry if I was awkward. It's not my intention. My intention is always to make sure that you guys get the most out of these episodes. But that's going to be all for this episode. Probably a bit of a shorter one, might be longer depending on how much I talked. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in the next episode. Take care.